All right. Hello again, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ryan Finnegan. I'm the Deputy Manager for U.S. Climate Policy Action at the World Wildlife Fund, where I help to manage the Americas All-In portfolio of work. If you're on this webinar, you're probably well acquainted with America is All In, but as we were just discussing before jumping onto the webinar, this is our first coalition-wide webinar in quite a while. So we really appreciate the opportunity to bring together leadership and representatives from local governments at the city and state level, tribal nations, business representatives in the private sector, cultural institutions, variety of different institution types together to work with one another and collaborate on climate action in a variety of different ways. We are also really excited about the agenda for today's call. We're going to basically divide into two primary sections. First and foremost, what we want to do is we want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 and get into the nitty-gritty on this new legislation and what it means for states, cities, various different types of institutions, really try and get as much actionable information as possible. And then what we're going to do with the rest of our hour is we're going to provide a step back and share some America's All-In updates, so you're understanding kind of the programmatic portfolio of work that is underway on research and analysis, and then upcoming and major events as we look into later moments in the fall. But as we kind of like kick off this first discussion of the Inflation Reduction Act and everything, can't really go into the details without first acknowledging all of the advocacy that has gone into this real roller coaster of a ride over the past 18 months, 10 years, 2 months, whatever period of time we're thinking about. We've been thrown a lot of curveballs, but a lot of folks within the America's All-In Coalition, within other networks, have advocated, whether that's through letters, whether that's through policy expertise, whether that's been through meetings on the Hill. We're incredibly grateful to be having the opportunity to have this conversation, where rather than talk about how cities and states and businesses can like fill a gap to bring the US towards its emission reduction goals and a clean energy economy, we're talking about how the non-federal actors in the US can work together with a federal government that is passed robust climate legislation and is interested in implementing it. So I want to do a shout out to all of the various groups that have led on that over the past months and years, and just express gratitude and excitement. Before tossing it over to our colleagues at RMI, who are going to really start to dive into some of the details of the IRA. And so I think that's all I have to say up top. Elisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm Elisa Peterson. I'm the Federal Policy Manager at RMI. And I'm going to spend some time just talking about broadly what's in the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and then going into it sector by sector. Then we'll pass it over to your sector leads to kind of talk about what that means specifically for each kind of stakeholder group. So I want to start by just saying that this is a historic level of funding for climate investment. If you look at the teal bar, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, we got $369 billion for climate investment. And if you kind of compare that to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is that kind of light blue bar, that was previously kind of our benchmark for climate investment. So IRA is about 4 times the size of the of ARA. And then that's not even the only climate bill that happened within Congress over the last 2 years. Because it wasn't really the main focus of climate, I feel like it snuck under the radar. But the CHIPS and Science Act invests an additional large sum of funding, mostly into R&D around climate. And then I think you're pretty familiar with the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But the combination of these three leads to the largest amount of climate investment we've seen, almost threefold ever. So this is a huge deal. And how that translates to carbon emissions is shown pretty well in this graph that was put together by Jesse Jenkins with the REPEAT project. So if you look at the at the blue net zero pathway line, you can see our goal is to get to 50% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. The purple line is the Inflation Reduction Act. And you can see that that gets us pretty close to the way there. It's expected to reduce emissions by 40%, and our goal is 50%. One thing that I think is kind of interesting, at least I found really interesting when I was looking at this graph, is that that green line is the House Build Back Better Act. I know a lot of people were really wanting the Build Back Better Act to pass, and there was a lot of things that got cut outside of climate in the Inflation Reduction Act. But as it relates to climate, you can see that we lost some, but we didn't lose a lot. So this Inflation Reduction Act is just a huge win, and means that we are much closer to our greenhouse gas emissions goals than we were ever before. With that being said, the IRA it's kind of like a bill with a bunch of carrots and no sticks. So what that means is that implementation of this is going to be more important than ever. And that's kind of where this all-in network comes in. Cities, states, corporations, healthcare, nonprofits, universities, you are all the implementers of this funding. And hopefully with this network, there's still that ability to push further, raise ambition, and actually achieve that 50% goal. So when this passed, I think a lot of people were really excited about it, but they wanted to understand, okay, when does this actually take effect? So here's kind of the timeline of the IRA and the investment that's going out. So August 16th was when the bill actually became law. And with that, a few kind of important things happened. For residential solar, it was retroactively upgraded to 30% again for the investment tax credit. A bunch of loans and grant programs for electricity went live. And then there was a new requirement that was created for electric vehicles where they need to be assembled in North America. The next kind of key date for when things are going to go out is January 1st, 2023, so the start of the new year. At this point, all the existing tax credits that were available that have been upgraded to have higher levels of incentive or more stringent requirements, those upgrades are all going to take effect. One of the more important ones is that EV manufacturer cap that capped electric vehicle manufacturers that you can only do 200,000 before the tax credit went away. That's lifted starting in 2023. Also, there's a new manufacturing production tax credit that goes live. The next timeline kind of key date that's important is 100 days out from passage. That's when the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund gets distributed. 1 year from passage is the deadline for guidance for the hydrogen production tax credit. And then 2 years from when it was passed is when states need to put together their buildings plan and get them approved to create these new rebate programs. So I think one thing that's really important is past this January 1st timeline, everything past that is all up to implementation. So these are deadlines, but those deadlines can be accelerated. And so making sure that, for instance, these new buildings programs that provide a ridiculous amount of incentives and rebates for heat pump installation and whatnot, trying to get those to hit the streets faster than 2 years will be really important. So there will be a lot when it comes to implementation to make this powerful. If I leave you with nothing else from this webinar, I think the main message is that the strategy of the transition has changed. So a lot of clean technology that previously wasn't economical or didn't break even with their fossil fuel counterpart is now cost effective. So if you ran the numbers a month ago and it didn't make sense to buy that electric vehicle, or it didn't make sense to kind of green your supply chain, it is worth rerunning those numbers, because this amount of funding is so substantial that any strategy or economic model that you previously ran is outdated at this point, which is really exciting, but it also means there's a lot of work to be done. So diving more into kind of what's included in the IRA, I'll go sector by sector. I'll start off with the electricity sector. There's a lot in here. I think the thing that I'll pull out the things that I think will be the most relevant to this network. The first is that the ITC and PTC, so investment tax credit and production tax credit for renewables, has been upgraded and there's expanded eligibility. So previously, if you didn't have a tax appetite, you weren't able to take advantage of the ITC and PTC. But now they made an exception where tax exempt entities, including cities, states, co-ops, and nonprofits, are actually able to take advantage of these tax credits where they weren't previously able to. There's also, for residential solar, it increases the ITC back up to 30% again, and storage is now available. The other really interesting one that I see is there's some great funding for community solar, specifically for low-income projects. So, you know, typically for residential or for commercial renewable projects, you can offset 30% of the upfront cost. For some low-income community solar projects, you can now offset 50% of the cost. So that's kind of a game changer and really important for making renewables accessible to lower income households. The other thing that this does is it actually, by making these incentives available and allowing co-ops and investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities to have larger access to tax credits, it's actually going to lower the average retail electricity price for everyone. So this projection from Resources for the Future shows that within the decade, they're expecting with IRA, the utility bills could decrease by 5%. And so this really goes into, you know, the bill is called the Inflation Reduction Act. And if you look at inflation, utilities were at a much higher, going up at a much higher rate than the other goods. And so by being able to kind of take control of utility bills and not only keep them level, but actually lower them is a major impact of this bill. From the industrial side of things, there is so much. So I think that the big thing that is important to know for this is that there are really generous tax credits for green hydrogen that makes it cost effective compared to dirty hydrogen. There's also really nice tax credits available for manufacturing batteries, solar, and wind domestically, which is important because there are requirements or even higher incentive levels if you can get to domestic manufacturing of materials. The only other, I think I'll just mention a few other programs that are exciting. I mentioned that this bill is mostly carrots and not really sticks. Literally the only stick that I'm aware of is this methane emissions fee, which I think is really powerful. It essentially sets a requirement for methane leakage, and if you don't meet that requirement, or the amount of methane emissions, and if you don't meet that requirement, the oil and gas industry has to pay a fee to the EPA. And so this will be, I think this will be a really important way to reduce methane emissions, which are actually a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So that will be great. And then the other thing that I think this network would find really interesting is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is kind of cleverly named, but it's really just a green bank. And so that funding, $27 billion, will be available, like I said, in about 6 months. And that could fund quite a few projects that maybe wouldn't have been financed before. I just want to dive a little bit into the impacts of the battery manufacturing. And the reason I want to talk about this is that you might have heard the EV tax credit has these new requirements around domestic battery manufacturing that makes it so that a lot of the electric vehicles on the market today might not qualify for the EV tax credit. And so scaling up domestic manufacturing of battery supply chain is incredibly useful. And through this tax credit, our analysis shows that these tax credits should make manufacturing batteries in the US cost effective and kind of reduce the gap between manufacturing them in China, which is where most batteries are currently manufactured. The other thing that I think is interesting to know about this is that there are some electric vehicle manufacturers like Tesla that currently manufacture their batteries in the US, and they will be eligible for this credit as well, which is up to $5,900 per vehicle. And so I think there's an opportunity to potentially see electric vehicle prices drop as they're getting more incentives for their battery manufacturing as well. I mentioned hydrogen. Green hydrogen is now cost effective with dirty hydrogen, which I think is really important because for industrial sectors, you can't actually offset emissions through basic electrification as easily. So this is going to be vital for clean steel, fertilizer, and shipping. For buildings, the things kind of fall into a few different categories. The first is improvements to existing tax credits. So all these tax credits exist today, but they exist at a much lower number and they're much less stringent to meet. So now with this 45L that's been upgraded, you could get $5,000 per new living unit that's being built. With the new 25C upgrades, you can get up to $2,000 for installing heat pumps. And then for commercial buildings, you can get up to $5 per square foot for commercial building retrofits. There's also these new state-run grant programs. And these are kind of, I would say these are the game changers. For the high efficiency electric home rebate program, you can get up to $8,000 for heat pumps. I'll put the caveat that this is just for low to medium income households. And I think that's actually really important because what this might look like is that a low income household could electrify their home for free, which has never happened before. So I think it's exciting that we could actually see deployment start more in the low income housing as opposed to high income housing like we've kind of typically seen with the transition. And then finally, there's some additional funding for buildings. This is not all comprehensive, but there's funding for building code upgrades, for contractor training, and for carbon labeling. And what this could mean is that we could see 2.4 million electrification upgrades in low-income households and 1.3 million whole home renovations. For the tax credits, all these tax credits are uncapped, which means that you could use them, as much as you want to. There isn't actually a limit on how many people could use these tax credits, whereas the rebate programs are capped at a certain level. But using the CBO score as kind of an estimate, 25C, which is that kind of the appliance upgrade tax credit, you could see 7.3 million heat pumps installed. 45L, which is the new homes tax credit, you could see 650,000 new efficient homes. And for 179D, it could result in 115 million commercial square foot retrofitted. So this is unprecedented levels of retrofits that could really decarbonize our building sector. And then finally, I'll end with transportation. I think the big transportation thing that happened is the revamping of the personal 7,500 EV tax credit. And I'll go into that in a little more detail on the next slide. But the other things that I think are worth highlighting are there's also this new used EV tax credit, which is $4,000. It's only if it's been passed one time over and you have to get it from a dealer. But most people don't actually buy new cars. And so I think this opens up electric vehicles more to LMI households, whereas before it was kind of more available to higher income households. And then the other important thing that I'll highlight for this network is that there's a commercial clean vehicle credit, which provides $7,500 to light duty vehicles and $40,000 for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And this doesn't have the same battery requirements as the personal vehicle. And so it's actually slightly easier to meet the requirements of this tax credit. Importantly, this tax credit's also made direct pay, which means that if you're an NGO or you don't have tax appetite, you can take advantage of this commercial clean vehicle credit where you previously were not able to. So just going into the impacts of the EV tax credit overhaul, I know that there's been a lot of press about how these new battery requirements make it so that the EV tax credits are difficult to use. But I think just it's important to step back and realize where we were at with the EV tax credit. So there was a manufacturer cap, which meant if you got past 200,000 vehicles, you no longer could take advantage of the EV tax credit. Tesla had hit that cap, and there were 4 or 5 other manufacturers that were going to hit that cap soon. So 72% projected EV sales by 2025 would have been ineligible due to this manufacturer cap. So the fact that that's removed in 2023 is a big deal. Also, 75% of Americans were unable to use the credit due to lack of tax appetite. And the IRA did this really interesting thing where you essentially can transfer over the tax credit to the dealer, making the tax credit a point of sale rebate. This is so important because if you are a low or middle income household, you typically can't just front $7,500 until you pay your taxes and get a tax return. So again, I think this makes this accessible. This makes electric vehicles accessible to more households. And then finally, as I mentioned before, 73% of Americans buy used cars. And so previously there was no federal credit for this. And the IRA creates this new tax credit for used EVs as well. So the combination of these changes to this tax credit, I think will make it more accessible to the everyday American. And so at least as it relates to that, we're really excited about kind of the upgrades to the EV tax credit. So I just spoke a lot about what's in the provision. I'm happy to answer questions kind of a little bit later, but at this point, I'll pass it over to the sector leads to talk about what this actually means for the All-In Network members, starting with Hayden from U.S. Climate Alliance.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Alyssa, and thank you for that excellent overview of some really exciting things that are in the bill. So yeah, obviously this bill didn't contain everything that we advocated for, like many of you, but it contains a lot of opportunities that run through states and state governments. And, a lot of our states are setting their budgeting priorities right now for 2023 and are able to take into account a much broader set of resources than they were anticipating. So I'll just highlight a few programs, some of which Alyssa touched upon, that we are highlighting to our states as really exciting opportunities. So just to, again, highlight the $8.6 billion in total that's running through state energy offices through the Homes and Hero rebate programs. That's very exciting. It'll help consumers make energy efficient upgrades to their homes. There's also, through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that Alyssa mentioned, of that $27 billion, $7 billion is set aside for states, tribal, and local governments, specifically to deploy clean energy or low emission technologies. that benefit low-income or disadvantaged communities through green banks. So that's very exciting. There's also $5 billion for states and other local entities through the climate pollution reduction grants. And 250 million of that pot is just specifically for planning. That'll go to an entity in every single state. So that's a really exciting opportunity for states to take stock, maybe potentially do some emissions reduction pathways modeling or planning for implementing ambitious actions. There's also $2.2 billion for state and private forestry conservation programs. There's $1 billion, as Alyssa mentioned, for state and local governments to adopt building energy codes. And I'll just note that 2/3 of that is set aside specifically for the adoption of net zero energy codes. And finally, there's a small program, it's $5 million in this bill that we think will have a big impact, which is for states to adopt more stringent tailpipe emission standards for cars and light trucks. So that's very exciting as well. And this is just a handful of things that I'll highlight that goes through states or some of our other constituents as well. And, you know, as Alyssa said, this will get us probably to around 40% emissions reductions. States will have a huge hand in implementing a lot of this funding, but everyone in this network knows that we need to go even further to hit that remaining 10% emissions reductions that we need to see by 2030. So that's for states. Very excited that this bill got passed and signed into law. I will pass it off, excuse me, to the next panelist, which I think is Kate from Climate Mayors on Cities.
Thanks, Hayden. As you said, very exciting opportunity. And I think for us, what is so thrilling is it's an opportunity to go from the incremental progress we've been able to make on climate change to really transformative and exponential progress. As Hayden, you highlighted, and Alyssa did a great job in her overview as well, there's a number of things that local governments will be partnering with states on. So we really want to make sure that we are coordinating closely on obviously the energy measures. And then there are direct grants that will go to local governments as well. And so, you know, we see this as a huge opportunity to decarbonize our buildings and electrify our transportation, to install solar and EV chargers, to train workers. So we're looking at both the sort of sector opportunities that we'll be able to do, but then also the way that we can play a role in education and outreach for the direct to consumer opportunities as well. So we really see local governments, cities fitting into each of these opportunities, whether it's the coordination with the state, whether it's education and outreach for consumers, making sure that our NGO partners are engaged and really doing everything we can to have policy alignment as well. So, you know, because so much of this is tax credits, funding, the carrot approach, we want to make sure that we're optimizing this funding to also align policy. I will say that, you know, that there's a lot here, and we want to make sure that we are providing the guidance for local governments. So we are Climate Mayors and C40 will be working together to develop a guidebook for mayors that really focuses on the role that local governments can play in each of these grant funding opportunities and the tax credits as well. So we're hoping to have that done mid-September. We're going to have first a high-level overview that will highlight each of these funding sources and the role that local governments can play specific to the climate opportunities within the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we'll have a deeper dive that continues to add additional information and analysis when the guidelines are available and we have some more clarity from the different agencies as rules are issued. So looking forward to playing that role and being a resource for cities moving forward. Thanks so much. And I'll pass it over to our next speaker. I think Zach from Ceres.
Thanks, Kate. And again, I'd like to echo what Ryan said at the top here, thanking everyone for your incredible advocacy over years and months, depending on the case. this is truly historic for our country, for the economy, for communities, and the climate. So from the business perspective, Ceres is also working on a both detailed summary for folks that we'll be sharing, and then we'll be hosting a webinar next month diving into the business specific elements of IRA, but just want to highlight a few here. We have expanded clean energy tax credits, both the ITC and PTC. That includes not only solar and wind, but also hydrogen, CCUS, offshore wind, and storage. And that will be converting to what we call a technology neutral tax credit available after 2025, meaning that you won't have to, there won't be technology specific tax credits, but just an emissions based tax credit, that zero emissions technologies get full credit for after 2025. And like Alyssa was mentioning, there are strong worker protection and EJ aspects of these tax credits. So there's a base rate of for most of the investment tax credits of 6%, and then in order to get the full 30% investment tax credit, you need to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards. And then there's additional 10% bonus credits for siting projects in energy communities, form of fossil fuel communities, both extraction and production, and then low income or EJ communities, as well as a 10% bonus credit for domestic content used in those projects. So this will, help greatly increase the amount of clean energy on the grid, as well as reduce costs for your PPAs and VPPAs as you continue to make your energy choices. Next slide. And then like Alyssa said, there's new 30% investment tax credit for commercial vehicles, capped at $7,500 for light duty vehicles and $40,000 for medium and heavy duty vehicles. Those do not have the domestic content and mineral requirements that the personal individual vehicle tax credits have. And then there's expanded charging property tax credits for those who invest in charging facilities. Then in buildings, there's $5 per square foot available for energy efficiency retrofits. So for those who own buildings, own and operate buildings, lease buildings, that's a great benefit, as well as those solution providers for commercial buildings, and then also for residential buildings. There's the rebates for consumers for technology providers in those industries. And then finally, there's a lot of manufacturing tax credits, incentives, grants, and financing available in the IRA. Tax credits for manufacturing and recycling solar, wind, and battery technologies, grants to retool industrial facilities, and for auto manufacturers to switch to producing electric vehicles. And then also the hydrogen production tax credit will support clean industry when folks procure those raw materials, and as well as CCUS tax credits, and then also quite a bit of funding for the government to buy clean procurement. So those of you who provide services and products to the government, there's funding there, as well as that will just greatly help expand the market and reduce costs for clean technologies. So a lot of benefits for businesses here to greatly expand these markets, expand domestic manufacturing, and reduce costs for everyone. And I believe Tim from Second Nature is next.
Thanks, Zach. I don't have to reinvent the wheel here. So at the bottom, once you look at the incentives uptake, many of our institutions, higher education institutions, are nonprofits, and this direct pay really benefits our institutions in that regard. So as large energy users and large emitters in some cases, this will be a direct advantage that you haven't been able to take advantage of in the past. Then the other areas, I think, both language here is knowledge gaps and worker gaps. Another way to think about it is higher ed, something specific to higher ed, is that we create knowledge and we transfer knowledge. So when you think about knowledge creation, in the IRA, there's increased funding at agencies for a number of areas of research. And this research doesn't have to be done by the research institutions that you would normally think of, but a vast array of institution types can apply for those grant funding opportunities. And that's with EPA, USDA, DOE, et cetera. So there's big bumps in research dollars for the higher ed sector. And in terms of knowledge transfer, there's two areas that I just wanted to mention. One is with workforce. You've heard a lot of how jobs will be created. Well, someone has to train people and educate people on how to perform those jobs. So I think the higher education sector has a real opportunity to step into that area, as well as the community programs that were discussed by states and cities, that many of those programs, as they get channeled through those partner organizations, higher education institutions will play an important role in helping support the implementation of those community-based programs, because many of them are located in areas that will be implementing those dollars. So I would really focus locally in that regard, as it's a federal bill, but it's going to come down locally. And I think higher education sector should be really well positioned to help partner with your local jurisdictions or your states in order to implement that action. As others have said, we're taking a deeper dive into IRA2, and on September 28th, we'll be having a webinar specific to higher education, and we'll get into more detail in those areas. But just to repeat, kind of large organizational footprints will benefit from that, knowledge creation opportunities, and knowledge transfer opportunities. Antonia, I guess, healthcare.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much, Tim. And I think it's probably appropriate that we're the last of the group, because in essence, healthcare intersects all of the previous areas that people have just focused on. So just quickly, in case folks don't know, I'm with Healthcare Without Harm, and Healthcare Without Harm is an NGO that has been working with the healthcare sector, specifically healthcare systems, to decarbonize and become more climate resilient, as well as a number of other work in a number of other sustainability areas, such as food, for example. And so we work with them on the ground to help them do this work, in addition to support and push for policies that will also benefit them, which clearly the IRA falls very squarely within that camp, and is what I've been working on specifically. So much again of what will help healthcare systems benefit and clean up and decarbonize and become more resilient has already been mentioned. And in particular, as I already said, we will be working with states. Health systems need to work with the states and for those funds they get, and cities and localities for those funds they get, to ensure that they can also go towards helping healthcare systems to decarbonize. Because healthcare has some really significant challenges which are unique to healthcare. They are critical operating systems. They operate, for example, hospitals 24/7. They are extremely high energy users and natural gas users. And there's a lot that needs to be done, and they need a lot of help. And this bill, I very much hope, will do exactly that. Though, as everybody noted, I'm still digging into the details and trying to understand what would benefit them most directly. Now, I'll talk about the direct benefit per the slide in just a second, but I did just want to highlight that everything being done ultimately is going to benefit healthcare sector decarbonization. So decarbonizing our electricity sector, our transportation sector, our industrial sector, and that is because of the health systems. 80% of their emission carbon footprint is coming from outside their walls, from the supply chain, for example. So decarbonizing that supply chain is really enormously critical to their commitments and their goals. So directly though, commercial buildings obviously is going to be really, really helpful to their decarbonization, helping them become more efficient. The other piece that has already been mentioned is the tax credits for clean energy and the direct pay option. That's something we worked very hard to ensure stayed in there. I was enormously pleased to see that it did stay in because we were worried for a time that it was going to be pulled out. 70% of healthcare systems are nonprofits. And so this is really an important piece for them. So solar and batteries, putting in place microgrids, that sort of thing should be, it will make it economically viable now for them to really move forward in this space. And then of course, the commercial clean vehicle tax credit that was mentioned, they do have fleets that I hope can benefit from this. And as I said, the broader supply chain piece is going to be influenced, hopefully in the right direction through this tax credit towards big truck electric vehicles. The other part that I just wanted to mention that isn't on this slide is that green fund working with the states. The 180-day time period I find a little concerning. It means we have to really tap into that one quickly. And so that's sort of on definitely on my radar. The other piece is just helping communities is another important component for healthcare systems, especially those low income and disadvantaged communities that are most impacted by climate change. Health impacts weren't mentioned here, but one of the analyses of the bill done by Energy Innovation does look at the health impacts, and it finds that the health benefits are significant, could avoid 3,700 to 3,900 premature deaths by 2030, especially in communities of color. And in the avoided air pollution could prevent up to 100,000 asthma attacks and 417,000 workdays. So that health component is very critical. Whoever you can keep from having to come to the emergency room is a huge plus. So I did want to end on that note as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa, Hayden, Kate, Zach, Tim, Antonia. Excellent. We do have a lot of questions already in the chat, so I'm going to read through them and try to get through as many as we can. So first, just a quick definition. Can you please define tax appetite, Elisa?
Yes, sorry. So it's like if you pay taxes. So, when you can only get a tax return if you owe taxes. And so if you don't owe $7,500 worth of taxes, you can't get that tax credit back. So that's like the tax appetite that you need to take advantage of the credit.
Thank you. And I think this may have already been answered, but is the direct pay option for tax credits available to colleges and universities?
It is.
Yes. Would agriculture-related methane production factor into the methane fee, or is it only oil and gas that is targeted? Or do we not know?
Good question that I feel like I might need to follow up on. I'm 90% sure it's just oil and gas sector, but I don't feel 100% confident. So I'll follow up if that's wrong.
Okay. Oh, Zach says only oil and gas. Thank you, Zach. And in addition to all our questions, there's a lot of really good comments in the Q&A box, just flagging that for everybody to take a peek. Is the Green Bank feature doled out to all 50 states, or is it a federal fund?
So it's actually very complicated, and I think how this will be implemented will be really interesting. Antonia mentioned that 180 days, that makes the timeline really fast. There's kind of two different ways that people are thinking about how it could be doled out. It could be given to a federal nonprofit that would then dole it out from there, or it could be given to existing state green banks. So I think that they're leaning more towards giving it to state green banks. The one problem with that is with that 180-day timeline, there are a lot of states that don't currently have green banks. And so whether or not they can take advantage, I think is a question. So there's a lot of question marks there, but I think they're leaning towards existing state green banks.
Great, thanks. And I think the answer to this is yes, but are these state-run programs the ones that have the August 2024 deadline for implementation?
Yeah, so those are for the 3 building programs. There's one for contractor training, one that's the electrification rebates, and then one which is the whole home retrofit. And those are both, they both have, so the way that it's set up is the state needs to design a program. They need to design a plan for how they're going to develop this program. And then DOE will need to approve the plan. And once that plan is approved, the funding will go out. And so the faster the state can design the program and get it approved for DOE, the faster that funding can go out to consumers.
Thanks. Can cities take advantage of the commercial clean vehicle credit?
They can, so that's
Yay.
awesome.
And the clean vehicle credits begin now, correct?
No.
No,
the
oh,
Clean
sorry.
Vehicle Credit is one of the ones that starts in the new year, so January 1st, 2023.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought some of them were available for personal vehicles now. My apologies. Is there an income restriction for the EV tax credits?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me clarify. So
Okay.
for the personal vehicles, that was already available. So this one is actually pretty complicated. So for the personal vehicles, there's the new made in North America requirement. And if it's made in North America and it hasn't hit the manufacturer cap, the personal electric vehicle tax credit is available. Starting in 2023, that manufacturer cap is lifted. So cars like Tesla would be available for the EV tax credit. And then the complicated thing is there's these new battery requirements that will make a lot of vehicles ineligible. But until those requirements are given out, the guidance is given out by the Treasury, those tax credits are available. So there's kind of this weird, probably like 4 to 6 month period where a lot of electric vehicles will be eligible for the tax credit. And then once the guidance is out, a lot of those tax credits will be removed until we can increase our domestic battery supply chain. I was answering the commercial electric vehicle tax credit, which is January 1st, 2023.
Got it. And then on income restriction for personal vehicles, it's 300,000 joint and 150 single. Is that correct?
I know 150 single off the top of my head is right. I'm not sure about the 300 joint. And those income restrictions, again, those start January 1st, 2023. So those aren't in place yet.
Okay. How would cities access funding from the Green Bank? Would it be a grant application? Or do we not really know yet?
That's complicated. It really depends on how it gets set up. My assumption is that most likely it'll be through existing state green banks. So they would need to work with their state green bank. So especially if you're a city that has a state green bank, you should talk to them now because they're about to get those. I think it's pretty guaranteed that those existing state green banks are going to get funding. It's more a question of for states that don't have existing, what that's going to look like.
Do we have any other resources we can share about the neighborhood access and equity grants and how that provides funding for active transportation projects? Maybe that's something we can follow up on. Yeah,
we can follow up on that. That one, yeah, I don't have as much details on that.
Okay. I don't know. This is an interesting one for local governments. Are we also looking at the drought funds as an opportunity? I don't know if we know as much about those yet either.
I might pass that to Climate Mayors. RMI isn't, but maybe Climate Mayors is.
Any insight on that, Kate, or shall we follow up on that one as well?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat?
The question was, for local governments, are we also looking at the drought funds as an opportunity?
I haven't dug deep into the drought funds, but I saw that comment come up and we will when we do our guidance. I know that there's a lot of interest from some of our leadership mayors on that piece. So yeah, I'll definitely take that back and dig into it.
Thanks. Okay, last two that I have. in my current queue, and then I'll take a peek at the other and then quickly pass to Ryan for finishing up. Are there direct pay options for energy storage?
So for residential, no. I know I have Russell on the call. Russell, do you know that off the top of your head? Oh, maybe he
Well,
can't
he
talk.
probably can't
Sorry.
talk, but he could put it in.
I don't believe so, but yeah, if you can put that in the Q&A chat, Russell, that would be great.
Okay, and then last, and then I'll pass it back to Ryan and try to answer the rest in the chat. When do the tax and direct pay incentives take effect? I think we already answered that, January 1st. Yep, okay. I'm gonna pass it back to Ryan and I'll try to answer other questions and you can help me, Elisa, in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Elisa. And thank you, everybody who was able to jump in with some constituency-specific, sector-specific add-ons. I did see 2 questions come in, about cultural institutions and about tribal nations. We weren't unfortunately able to be entirely comprehensive in this call. I think we did a great job of hitting a lot of points, but appreciate those questions. And I think we definitely do want to dive into additional follow-up points for various other sectors and types of institutions. Just with the remaining few minutes before we wrap up the hour, we're going to dive into some of our America's All-In updates over the next couple of weeks and months. If you want to jump to the next slide, just really quickly taking a step back, looking at the context of when the IRA has passed. It's passed at a pretty good time with respect to having the opportunity now to showcase a lot of ambition, make this pivot towards implementation in a really profound way that aligns with some actions and events that are taking place in the lead up to COP27 towards the end of the year. And then on the domestic front, the Department of Energy is co-hosting the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in Pittsburgh, and then Climate Week is typically on a lot of folks' radars as we head into September. But going into a little bit more detail on the next slide, there's 3 pieces of analysis that All-In has in the pipeline that we want to share with folks. The first is dropping in the next couple of days is an All-In pathway to 2030 focused on US methane emissions reduction potential. That has been led up by the Center for Global Sustainability at UMD, and it's going to showcase what, now that we have the IRA and then incorporating the role of state and local actors, how we can reduce methane emissions in the United States between now and 2030. Like Elisa mentioned earlier in the webinar, it's an extremely potent greenhouse gas with a lot of opportunity for the US to make reductions. And then RMI and WRI will jointly be sharing 2 publications later in September focused on tactics for building decarbonization and then co-benefits of building decarbonization. So hopefully, again, distilling some of the information that we've talked about today, but really providing an action guide and detailing different benefits of different institution types taking these sort of actions on electrification. Looking into Climate Week more broadly, we have a number of events in the pipe. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So a lot of things will be happening at Climate Week. 2 that we just want to point out in particular that our teams have been working hard on is on Thursday, September 22nd, America's All-In is going to be working with We Mean Business to launch the SME Climate Hub in the United States. So the SME Climate Hub is a platform and a resource for small and medium-sized businesses to take meaningful action to reduce their own emissions, and they can participate in the global race to zero by utilizing the SME Climate Hub and starting to track their carbon footprints and get other resources for mitigating their emissions. We'll be launching a US campaign focused on whether those are small businesses in a specific state or a specific city, or in various supply chains, getting those businesses better engaged in the job of reducing their emissions. Then we'll also be hosting an all-induction cooking workshop that builds off of the upcoming building electrification reports that'll be released in September. So those are just 2 events to be mindful of for anybody who is going to be in New York for Climate Week and is interested in engaging or learning more. Finally, as we get towards the end of the year, a lot of what All In has done, America's All In was obviously originated at this idea of ensuring that the United States could meet its commitments to Paris. And whether that has been with an engaged federal government or without an engaged federal government, it's been monumentally important, I think, to bring a whole of society message and real kind of like receipts on the action that is happening at the state and local level to the international scene, to connect with international partners, and to convey the critical importance of localities and businesses working with their national governments to deliver results. And so America's All In will be taking, more or less a five-step approach to ensuring that when we get to COP27 in Egypt, there is a US narrative and US coordination that reflects a whole of society approach. We'll have delegation tracking for folks who might be on the ground in Egypt. We'll be having an events program and a coordinated pavilion. We'll be working on analytical products that really speak to the subnational and non-federal contributions towards us reaching our US NDC target, and then setting up meetings and policy resources for folks. So jumping to the next slide, these are all additional information that we can follow up on. But sorry, if we can jump to the next, or we can jump to the next one again. So just for folks who might be on the ground and are interested in participating, COP27 happens in the first 2 weeks of November. America's All In will be engaged over that course of that middle weekend, coordinating a lot of federal and non-federal participation. That'll obviously be happening in the context of the US midterm elections, which happened just the second or the third day of COP. So the US is now, really in a position that we weren't in a month or so ago, of being able to bring some proven results on the federal front. And all of a sudden our climate goals are within reach. And there's a lot of excitement that, we've gone into some detail about on this call, but there's a lot more nuanced messages that we can bring as well. There's a lot of policy that has been moving at the state and local level. There's a lot of institutional action that's been happening. And we want to make sure that we convey this in as strong a way as possible over the course of these few days when we'll be on the ground at COP. And so I think this is just about the last slide. For folks who are interested, either in showcasing the work that they've been doing or getting engaged with other US actors who are going to be on the ground at COP, we have a delegation tracker and event interest form that are live now for folks to put in their information on. And then as we get further into the fall, we know a lot of folks are going to be on the ground. A lot of folks won't be on the ground too. We're going to be figuring out ways when the global climate community is talking about the United States, that we're elevating the work of folks within this network and this coalition. And I think that is just about it. I'll just wrap up really briefly, thanking again Elisa and the whole team at RMI for putting the in-depth breakdown of the IRA together, as well as all our coalition partners for jumping in and providing additional detail. And we hope to be in touch with all of you soon. So thanks again.